Alright, hello everyone, welcome to the first lecture video of third week of February. So in this chapter we're gonna go over the chapter 4, which is the visual elements. So in the next two chapters we will discuss the visual elements and principle of designs that compose a work of art or design. So we will focus on these points: identifying types of lines, explaining how artists create shape and mass, describing how real and implied light function in art, and characterize these 4 points we're going to look at the next lecture. So we're going to focus on these 3 right here. Alright, so let's talk about a point. So a point is a basic mark, such as a dot, or a pixel, or a brush stroke. So when point is added to a blank canvas, we create a dialogue between the basic visual element and the surrounding space. So in this section, we will look into 2 types of point. So first, a focal point is the primary point of interest in the composition. So by its size and compositional location, orientation or color, a focal point activates the design and thus attracts the attention of the viewer. So as you can see, a focal point is the primary point of interest in a composition. It's the first thing that you're going to see when you look at a work of art. So as you can see in this painting of Leonardo's Last Supper, all the visual composition is pointing to the Christ, which is the main subject and the most important figure in this painting. And in this painting, Leonardo used technique called one-point perspective to direct all architectural diagonal lines pointing towards the center figure here, as you can see over here. So here is a good example of one-point perspective. So in this painting, you see that all visual elements come together to a one point right here. And from there, a perspective is created to guide through its composition. So in this case, this point right here will be the focal point. And here will be the focal point will be the Christ. So next next point that we're going to be looking at is going to be an array. So array is a collection of points, and we can create rich texture and entire images using an array. So an array of points can create an entire image while retaining the energy of the individual parts. So in this example, the artist combined images of hundreds of everyday people to create the image of then American President Barack Obama. So this is conceptually strong work of art because through this way of portraying the figure, the image suggests that this political figure is a man of people rather than a remote politician. So you're looking at the conceptual way of this, using this kind of a technique of array points. Another example would be this example that we have been looking multiple times, George Seurat. And his points are different than the Obama poster. So in here, Seurat is interested in the science behind the optical illusion of colors and is when the color is placed within the close proximity. So when you zoom in, as you can see, Seurat is placing 2 distinct and complementing colors right next to each other within such a close proximity so that he initiates this optical illusion of illuminating. So let's take a look at this. So I think these 2 will explain about this a lot better than I do, so I'll leave it to the experts, and let's take a look at this video real quick.
Into its components, that is, instead.
Some say they see poetry in my paintings. I see only science.
We're in the Art Institute of Chicago, and we're looking at Sunday Afternoon on the Isle of the Grand Jatte by Georges Seurat.
And that was a quote by Seurat, whose ambition was to bring science to the methods of Impressionism.
What's interesting is that the science that he was thinking about has been, to some extent, overturned, and we're left with the poetry.
The science that he was referring to had to do with ways of making the painting seem more luminous, to seem brighter.
And I have to say, he's really succeeded. This is a painting that is brilliantly luminous and incredibly complex when it comes to color. So he's taking the earlier traditions of the Impressionists and he's imposing on them the science of vision and especially the science of color that had been developed by people like Chevroy and Rude. He was interested in this idea of dividing color into its components. That is, instead of trying to find the perfect purple, which is really hard to do.
You mean when you mix it on your palette?
Well, that's right. And the reason is that when you take, say, a blue and a red and you mix them together, that red is not pure red. It's got lots of other things in it. The blue is not pure, and when you mix them together, it gets too muddy. So how do you get a pure purple that you might see in nature? Well, Seurat's solution was to take the red, take the blue, and put them next to each other so that as your eye receives that light, the light waves do the mixing themselves.
Right, and this is called optical mixture, and this is really a change from academic technique of finding that local color of an object, mixing it on your palette and then applying it. And if you think back to the Impressionist project, that what the Impressionists sought after was to really create a sense of outdoor light. And I think using this divisionist method, this idea of optical mixture, Seurat really did that in the Grand Jatte. We have a real sense of Parisians outside on a sunny day and the real strong sense of sunlight streaming through the trees.
So clearly there is this bridge back to Impressionism, and in fact the artist used the term neo-impressionism.
Okay, so that's Georges Seurat. The style that is associated with is called pointillism. As you can see, these like small points.
When he
Okay, so now next thing that we're going to be looking at is line. So line is one of the simplest and most versatile elements of design. So line may be defined as these three actually: orientation, direction, and degree of continuity. So strictly defined, or a physicist would say, a line is a two-dimensional path traced by a moving point. So the first definition emphasizes the unique dynamism of line. The remaining three definition emphasize its connective power, as you can see over here. So lighter and more fluid than any of other visual elements, line can add a special energy to a design when it's used correctly. And simply by drawing a line, we can activate a space, define a shape, or create a compositional bridge. So each line has its own distinctive quality, and this quality is largely determined by the line's orientation, direction, and degree of continuity. So orientation refers to the line's horizontal, vertical, or diagonal position. So diagonal lines and curving lines are generally the most dynamic, meaning implying the most visual movement within the composition. Diagonals and curved lines are charged with energy, and they suggest action and movement, as you can see in this example. And horizontal lines, as you can think of, what would it imply? There's a lot of horizontal here, right? So horizontal, as you can think of, is all about stability and evoking the sense of calm and soothing visual experience. Whereas vertical lines imply potential change, meaning that its precarious nature can be altered and release its potential energy. So you can think of it as a ball, like a golf ball sitting on top of a hill. And once its stable position is disturbed, maybe someone kicked it over or something, now it is in motion, packing much more energy, releasing its potential energy. So however, when verticals adhere to the edge of the design, as you can see on the right side of the example C, you see this line right here, they become tethered and thus lose mobility, losing its potential energy. Whereas free-floating verticals like these seems ready to topple at any point. Direction refers to the implied movement of line, so we can use line weight to accentuate its direction, as you can see on the example B right here, and C, where thicker lines emphasizes its direction more than the thinner ones. And if you see the example A right here, you can notice that the swelling line suggests a forward or outward movement, and shrinking lines suggest inward movements. So we can find directional lines playing an important role in Henri Cartier-Bresson's photography of a small Italian village. So you can see the strong directional line happening through the interesting architecture of the scenery. So take a look at the stairway, how it go down, and then this kind of starts another line here, and also he has this kind of a, I don't know what it is, but in this photograph it uses the movement, and the line with the composition guides the movement. The other example is this painting called The Raft of the Medusa by Theodore Géricault in 1819. So as you can see, Géricault carefully positioned and depicted the human postures to create a sense of a line where our eyes' attention follows towards to the top right corner of the composition, which will be right here. So Géricault's example is a great contrast in linear movement, which creates a strong emotional effect. And this work of art is based on an actual event, the wreck of the French government ship Medusa off North Africa in 1816. So only a few of those on board survived, some by clinging to the raft, and Géricault chose to depict the moment when those on the raft sighted a rescue ship. So in this composition, virtually all the lines in the composition are diagonal, pointing towards here. It packs a lot of movement. It's very dramatic. Géricault uses them to create two conflicting centers of interest, thus increasing the tension of the scene, as you can see over here. So picked up by the light, the limbs of the survivors carry our eyes upward to the right, where a dark figure silhouetted dramatically against the sky waves his shirts to attract a rescuer's attention. Also, a lone rope, as silhouetted, carries our eyes leftward to the dark form of the sail, where we realize that the wind is not taking the survivor towards their salvation, but away from it. Take a look at the video about this painting.
We're in the Louvre looking at Géricault's Raft of the Medusa. This is a massive painting.
It's 16 by 23 feet, and it's important to remember that large paintings were reserved for important subjects that were generally ennobling or that showed a heroic deed of some sort, and this painting could not be further from that. It's not drawn from ancient Greek and Roman history. It's not a biblical subject.
The story behind this subject is one of the most gruesome in the history of the sea that had taken place just 3 years earlier.
The title of the painting, The Raft of the Medusa, is referring to a ship called the Medusa.
It was part of a small fleet of ships that were trying to reclaim Senegal from the British as a French colony. And it had about 400 people on board. Many of them were settlers. There were about 150 soldiers.
The man who was going to be the new governor of Senegal was also on board.
The problems began when the ship ran aground in the open ocean. There weren't enough lifeboats. And so the captain ordered the ship's carpenter to construct a raft from some of the lumber of the boat to hold everybody that couldn't fit into the lifeboats.
Well, naturally, those who went into the lifeboats were those of higher status, the captain, the officers, the politicians, and those that ended up on this makeshift raft were primarily the soldiers and the settlers. The idea was that the raft would be towed.
But within only a few minutes, when the captain realized that the lifeboat was being slowed by the raft, the line was severed and the raft was allowed to drift out to sea on its own.
So 150 people were abandoned at sea. What happened on the raft was horrific. There was starvation, murder, and of course the worst thing imaginable that happened was cannibalism. And there were even reports that some people were intentionally killed to provide food for the survivors.
And to preserve the small amounts of supplies that remained. And all of this is depicted in wrenching detail. The artist interviewed survivors. He made a full-scale model in his studio. He created small stages with clay figures in order to organize the figures, and he even retrieved body parts from the morgue, brought them back to his studio in order to be able to accurately depict putrefying remains.
You mentioned its naturalism, its realism, but in some ways it's not at all real. The bodies are clearly based on ancient Greek and Roman sculptures, on the studies of the nude figure that artists had to do at the Academy. This crescendo of this pyramid of figures, clearly things were not organized in this way on the raft. This is a composition by an artist making a statement, saying something.
Creating a kind of anti-heroic painting that is still in the visual language of the Academy.
The captain had been
Okay, so that's Theodore Géricault's The Raft of the Medusa.
appointed by
So let's take a look at the, let's keep on looking at the lines. So this time we're going to look at the continuity of line. So continuity or linear flow can enhance direction, as we saw at Géricault's The Raft of the Medusa. So example D right here shows that continuous lines tends to generate a stronger sense of direction than broken and jagged line, which is right over here. So when we think about the continuity, we think about the implied lines as well. So in addition to actual lines, linear forms and lines formed by edges, our eyes also pick up lines that are only implied. So a common example is the dotted line, as you can see on this example, and where a series of dots are spaced closely enough that our mind connects them together. The 18th century French painter Jean-Antoine Watteau created a sort of dotted line of subject figures in this work of art. So starting with the city couple at the right here, our eyes trace a line that curves in a gentle S-curve and leaves us evaporating into the hazy air on the left, on this side right here. So as you can see how the artist connects these subject matters by implied line here. So next thing that we're going to be looking at is going to be shape. So a shape is a flat enclosed area, and it is a two-dimensional form which occupies an area with identifiable boundaries. And these boundaries may be created in these four ways. So by enclosing an area within a continuous line, surrounding an area with other shapes, as you can see over here, filling an area with solid color or texture, as you can see right here, and filling an area with gradiated color or texture, as you can see on the D right here. A volume or mass is a three-dimensional enclosure. So circles and squares are shapes, and spheres and cubes are volumes. So in two-dimensional space, you can use gradation or shading to make two-dimensional shape appear three-dimensional or volumetric, as you can see in this example right here. So both flat and gradiated shapes can be used to create a strong imagery. So in Aaron Douglas's work, flat silhouettes combined with transparent targets create an energetic panorama. I mean, we can almost hear the speaker in the center and to feel the movement of the crowd of this work of art. Excuse me. Of course, our dear Pablo Picasso here. The figures are represented rather flat than three-dimensional, as you can see. An intentional move that many cubist painters embraced. So another good example of use of flat shapes to create a strong imagery here. In Diego Rivera's Detroit Industry, a combination of size variation and shading suggests the volume and increases the illusion of the space. So here, definitely, he's taking approach to more of a visually faithful approach of shapes, where things are gradiated and shaded to show the three-dimensionality of the figures and objects and things like that. I think this murals is really interesting work of art, so let's take a look into this.
We're at the Detroit Institute of Arts in Rivera Court, which is where Diego Rivera's world-renowned Detroit Industry murals are. It's the heart of the museum. We're very proud of this, and it inspires artists from Detroit and around the world. Rivera came here in the early 1930s, and the only requirement was that it was about Detroit and Detroit's industry. So he went to the Ford River Rouge plant, which is a suburb of Detroit, and he was fascinated. He was fascinated by the machinery, by the rhythm, but what he also did was put a lot of his own views in. The men on the line were all ethnicities and races, according to Rivera, but in reality it wasn't like that at all. He was commissioned actually by Edsel Ford, who was a modern art collector. And needless to say, Henry Ford, his father, was not very happy because he was pretty conservative. If you look on this wall, you see a man with a ruler, and he's a composite of Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. So he symbolizes the man who is stern and always listening and watching. Also on that wall, you have warplanes that were used for destruction, poison gas manufacture that mutated cells. Then on the other side, you have the worker, who just happens to have a red star on his glove and a hammer in his hand. So the dichotomy of industry being good and evil is here. You see a group of people who are being given a tour of the plant, so they're watching the workers. And Rivera thought, oh, this is the bourgeoisie, they don't have to work, they have all this leisure time. So he patterned some of them after comic book characters. So you'll see Dick Tracy, you'll see the Katzenjammer Kids, and then Charlie Chan. So in his own way, he's making fun of them. And then on this wall, he considered agriculture the first industry. So he has a baby being born out of the earth. And then on either side, he has fruits and vegetables that are native to Michigan. So everything really comes out of the earth. And there was a right-wing priest, Father Conklin, who had a radio show that called for the murals to be whitewashed because he said that was blasphemous and he thought the nudity was pornographic. But actually, the administration of the museum and Edsel Ford and the workers all rallied behind it. So we're very fortunate that this, which really is his best work, remains the heart of the DIA and a wonderful symbol for Detroit.
All right, so that's Detroit Industry. All right, let's talk about light. So light is something that is very mysterious and miraculous at the same time. So our ancestors often considered the sun to be a divine power. So now we have a better understanding of what light is, and we have learned how to generate it ourselves through use of electricity. So light is a key visual element in works of art, and when we talked about light in art, we refer to a real light and the representation of light, and the real light refers to how an object interacts with light in its environment. So we looked at this example, Sainte-Chapelle in France. So at Sainte-Chapelle, the chapel that we looked before, a natural light passes through this beautiful stained glass and creates this dramatic visual effect. So that was the one of the main visual effects that this architecture was about. Let's take a look at another example. So Caravaggio was an Italian painter during mid to late 16th to 17th century, who combined realistic observation of the human state with a dramatic use of lighting to compose his painting and use it as a conceptual element. So on the right, the painting called The Conversion of St. Paul, the figure is illuminated by an unknown light source, seemingly almost impossibly. And the light, long considered as a divine power, is used here to visually narrate the story of St. Paul's Epiphany. Let's take a look at this work of art a little bit closer.
We're in the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome, and we're looking at one of the most famous paintings by Caravaggio. This is the Conversion of Saul.
And this is one of two paintings that Caravaggio painted here in the chapel called the Cherasi Chapel, named for the Cherasi family. And in fact, Tiberio Cherasi is buried here in this chapel.
The painting itself shows an important story. It shows Saul, whose job it was to persecute Christians, and he was on the road to Damascus when he was blinded by light, and he heard a voice.
And that voice, the voice of Christ, said to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And Saul was blinded for 3 days.
Now that's important because Christ had been in his tomb for 3 days before he was resurrected. And Jonah in the Old Testament remained in the fish, which is often called a whale, for 3 days.
So there is this Old Testament tradition that this is going back to of 3 days in the darkness before being saved by the divine.
And it puts Saul, whose name becomes Paul, in this tradition that comes out of the Old Testament.
So here we only see that divine supernatural force as light flooding down on Saul. He's fallen off of his horse.
Caravaggio has stripped out everything that's not essential. He's created monumental figures that fill the frame of the canvas. He's pushed them forward, and he's placed them against this deep, dark background. So when elements are illuminated, they stand out against that background.
Saul's face is the only face here that's illuminated.
Well, the groom doesn't even seem to notice what's going on.
And that's what makes it all the more personal. It is only Saul that hears God's voice. So this darkness that this is set in, no architecture, no landscape, this tenebroso, this dark style, perhaps deriving from the art of Leonardo da Vinci, but here taken so far by Caravaggio, and that darkness eliminating everything else that could distract us from this incredibly powerful moment.
It's interesting to think about why this is happening at this particular moment at the turn of the 17th century.
The naturalism we see here, the way that we're getting the rear end of the horse, the dirt on the ground, the figure of the groom who's taking care of the horse. Looks like a man that Caravaggio probably has to model for him that he met in Rome. And that naturalism is part of this interest in legibility, in clarity in art that comes out of the Counter-Reformation.
And specifically out of the Council of Trent. The idea was that...
Alright, so that's Caravaggio's The Conversion of St. Paul. A beautiful painting. And the way he uses the light is just so fascinating.
painting could be
Alright, so next thing that we're going to be talking about is value. So value refers to the relative lightness or darkness of a surface. So the word relative is significant here, as you can see in this example. So lightness or darkness of a shape is largely determined by its surroundings. For example, on a white surface, a gray square seems stable and imposing, as you can see in the example right here, whereas the same gray square has a less visual weight and seems luminous when it's surrounded by a black ground in the example B right here. And the example in the bottom here, a value scale further demonstrates the importance of the context. So if you take a look at this, just a gray bar, it almost looks like this is darker right over here and this is lighter, but that is not actually the case. It is, I'm not lying, this is all same color. It is just that how our eyes perceive depends on the intensity of the background. So so in 2D art, artists have become interested in modeling mass in two-dimensional through value. So discovered and perfected by Italian painters during the Renaissance, the technique called chiaroscuro, Italian word for light and dark, is usually used to create this kind of drawings before they actually paint it. With chiaroscuros, artists employ values to record contrast of light and shadow in the natural world. So as you can see here on Leonardo da Vinci's unfinished drawing, we can see how the miraculous effect that the artist was able to achieve through this technique. All right, so that was it for this today's lecture, and then I'll see you guys on Wednesday evening for the lecture 2. And also, I wanted to remind you guys that the final exam is coming, which is going to be open on March 1st, is next week, and then it's gonna be open till March 5th. And it is about 30 questions, and then it's time limited to 40 minutes, so you will not have a lot of time to Google your questions and things like that. And also, I usually create my questions, so you won't be able to find those in Checkers or anything like that. So I suggest that you study up, and I'll be providing study guides as well. So if you study guides, I think it's about 70 questions study guys. If you study that, you should do fine on this first exam. So if you have any questions on the study guides, just let me know, and I will also provide a review video by Thursday, so that you guys can take a look at the review video on the study guide. All right, I'll see you guys on the next lecture.